So let me now talk about current events and how that might, again, affect a GAP project and how it affects businesses and leaders more broadly. So at the highest level, what's happened with COVID? COVID fundamentally has changed this idea about place. Place being where we shop, where we're entertained, where we work, where we go to school. That whole idea that, I go to a grocery store to do my shopping. I go to a movie theater to watch a movie. I go to a classroom, my classes. That has all been turned upside down with COVID. And in the process, many of the things have occurred that have accelerated technology adoption. Many things have changed competitive positioning. Many of the players that were used to traditional modes of where things happen. Think of movie theaters, AMC as an example. How fundamentally their business has changed overnight. Grocery stores, with the advent of Instacart and Amazon, et cetera, the whole idea of people having to go to a store fundamentally has changed. Healthcare. Kaiser, we just had Jody Lesh, who's the Chief Innovation Officer from Kaiser. She had just mentioned that before COVID, about 15% of Kaiser's health visits were telehealth. During COVID, it went up to 75%. Huge increase. And I think it was even more interesting than the 75% is the fact that she said once COVID ends, she thinks they'll never go back to 15%. The percent of telehealth visits is going to probably end up somewhere in between 30%, 35%, et cetera. So this whole idea about change in place, people working from home, and a whole bunch of applications that have supported this. So contactless applications, the ability to do payments and security and authenticating yourself without having to make physical contact, without having to sign something or touch something. There's numerous companies now that are doing work in that area. Video conferencing, Zoom just announced their results yesterday. They announced that they're on track for $1 billion in revenues per quarter. $1 billion per quarter. Huge growth in video conferencing and collaboration tools. Salesforce just bought Slack because they realized that ability for people to communicate with one another on Slack is going to be a fundamental business tool for CRM applications like Salesforce offers. Last mile delivery, I've mentioned some of the applications with companies like Neuro. Drones would be another example of this. More and more work on last mile delivery. So a whole bunch of new areas of innovation that are accelerating, and then negative impact, as I mentioned, on other applications. Think about real estate as an example. If you're somebody that owns lots of commercial real estate, office buildings, retail, probably a tough play. Doesn't say unilaterally every single organization's in a tough play, but a lot of rethinking about how much space companies need, a lot of rethinking about retail, and do you really need a lot of retail square footage, or can a lot of stuff be driven to online transactions? Healthcare, another example, complete change in healthcare with telehealth and other related applications. So what are some of the broader implications of all of this and things to consider? First of all, there's been a notable acceleration of adoption. There's an interesting study that came out from Twilio. Twilio runs a communications platform. A lot of the text messages that we receive from airlines when they tell you a flight is late or a gate change or whatever, all of the text messaging, they run a communications platform that supports that. They talked about digital transformations because they have to deal with a lot of companies that have to go from manual to digital in what they offer. They said historically, it would take about 6 years for an organization to make a digital transition. In COVID, they said it was about 6 months. 6 years went down to 6 months. And think about all of the other adoption we've had to do. Again, e-commerce, telehealth, all the recommendation engines that we use, last mile delivery. A lot of these things we say, yeah, I'll try it over time, but it's going to be a few years, slow burn on trials by companies, et cetera. All of this has been compressed. So you want to be thinking about, for your clients and your competitors, has there been a more rapid fire adoption of technology, and are you taking advantage of that? The second thing is that there's an uneven impact on companies, on individuals, and on society of technology. So number one, at a broad enterprise level, technology companies have done much better in COVID on balance than traditional industries have, like manufacturing, like real estate, like travel. So you want to look at what type of company are you in and what type of company are you selling to? And is that company that you're selling to going through a difficult change, and how does that affect your offer to them? Same issue goes on uneven impact for individuals. Remember that the digital divide is one of the big challenges we have in the US. And digital divide has got several parts to it. It's got broadband connectivity. Do you have access to high-speed internet? But it's also, do you have devices, digital devices like smartphones? And do you have efforts on digital literacy to be able to educate and engage people on online transactions, online communications, etc. So you want to think about, is the impact even or uneven where you're at? Another thought here is the need for leaders to think about how their jobs are changing due to COVID. So it used to be like when I went to business school, a lot of the focus was on shareholders. Just make the shareholders happy, give them a good rate of return. Everything else will be sorted. People will be employed, governments will be happy because they'll collect taxes, blah, blah, blah. That view is becoming more and more passé, and more of the view is the CEOs need to think about a much broader set of constituents. They need to be thinking about not only shareholders, but customers. They need to think about employees. Many employees have got more clout now than they ever had to guide a company. Google has had revolts over some of their early work when they wanted to do business in China, when more recently they wanted to sever some executives that were involved in wrongdoing. The employees said, why are you paying these guys off for being involved in behaviors that violated the values of the company? So you want to think about employees. You want to think about the public at large, elected officials, regulators, all sorts of community members. Are you serving all of them? Because if you're not doing that, you will have big pushback. And then, I'd like to get into more detail here, but the new normal. It's very easy, and it's kind of, I think the way our minds are wired is to try and always kind of revert back to whatever we are used to. The problem is the world is a dynamic place. The world changes, and the world looks different depending on what community you're in, what nation you're in, you know, what if you're inside a company, are you in a company that's going through a turnaround or not, et cetera. You want to look at the environment that you're in and say, what is the new normal? And say, how are you going to operate? I'll give you a small example at the Easton Center. One of the big mantras I've had with our team is saying, listen, you know, we're used to doing all these in-person events, and certainly when COVID lessens, we'll go back and do in-person events. But we should not go back to solely in-person events. We have doubled and tripled our attendance by going online, because now we can reach alumni, we can reach broader members of the community all over the country, we can reach people abroad, et cetera. So in this environment, the new normal should be hybrid, would be my message on the Easton Center. Find a way to do things in person and remote concurrently. Every industry has to think about their own new normal, and I'll give you a couple of examples here in a minute. The final thing I just want to say is, as you look at COVID, and now we're kind of seeing the second wave with the Delta variant, when you think about what the implications are, I would submit that this idea about reverting back to the old ways is lessening more and more now that we're in the second wave of COVID. Now people are saying, you know what? We're going to have to get used to being more comfortable on a long-term basis with a change in place. with the use of online tools, the use of technology, et cetera. There's going to be more and more of that, and that is going to manifest itself in acceptance about a hybrid environment would be one example. The idea about being remote in all environments, thinking about pitching to an investor. I had Barry Eggers speak in one of my tech management classes a few months ago. He's a founding partner of Lightspeed Ventures, big VC in the Silicon Valley. And I said, Barry, what's the mantra today of all the startups that are pitching you for money? Is it all about AI and data and all that? He said, Terry, he says, all that AI and data stuff is stuff that happened 2 years ago. He says, today, every venture that comes in has to be able to speak to remote. What does remote mean in their business? Very interesting comment about a new normal, repositioning companies, thinking about new innovation opportunities, new customers, et cetera. Certainly thinking about remote in a management standpoint. Again, I'm going to show you an interesting research study on working from home. Long-term business assumptions. So how much time are we going to be traveling in the future? How much time do we need to be in person? How much value is going to be on local? So many of you may have heard one of the senior execs at JP Morgan, made a comment to their employees a couple of months ago about working remote. And he basically said, if you can go eat out in a restaurant, then you can come back in the office. There was massive back pressure on that comment. It was viewed as tone deaf to what's going on in the environment where many employees want the flexibility to be able to work in a variety of environments. Many employees don't feel it's safe still to go. There's a variety of reasons. And to say if you can go to a restaurant, you can come into the office was viewed as a really ill-advised comment. Final comment here, multi-mode models. So Microsoft in their latest results announcement was talking about, number one, why their market cap is so high. They're worth about $2 trillion now, huge valuation. And obviously a lot of it is due to Azure and it's due to their online tools. But they talked about one of the newest areas of focus are hybrid working tools. So tools that are assuming that people aren't just remote or just in the office, but they're going to toggle between in-person and remote. And all the things that allow people the access to the content they need, the security that they need, understanding where they are and how you tie people in that may be remote and in person. All those hybrid working tools are the areas that they're focusing on now. Says a lot about what they believe the new normal is going to be. Now, let me do this here. I'd like to share a couple of articles that kind of get at this new normal that I was referring to earlier. So I'm showing you here a recent article that came out from the McKinsey Global Institute. They do some really interesting research and implications for business. And this one was all about it's time for leaders to get real about hybrid. And they start out with this survey of CEOs. And you'll see on the left side of the screen here, they surveyed CEOs pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, and asked the executives saying, where are people going to be working? Pre-pandemic, they said 92% of all employees are going to work more than 4 days a week in the office. Post-pandemic, they moderated a bit and they said, 52% will be greater than 4 days, but 36% greater than 3 days. So they're still saying, 80, 90% of people, 3 days or more a week are still going to be in the office. Now, McKinsey then interviewed employees. And what did the employees say? Something very, very different. Pre-pandemic, most employees, 62% said they assume they're going to be fully on site. 30% said they'd be remote or hybrid, and then 8% remote. Post-pandemic, look how many employees now are assuming they're going to be in a hybrid mode, want to be in a hybrid mode, 52%, up from 30%. How many fully remote? From 8% to 11%. So that premise, in this case, it was executives that are not reading the environment well and not coming up with their own new normal, missed what is a fundamental shift. And so one of the messages I've got obviously tonight for you is be thinking about What is that new normal? What is causing the changes there? Is it technology? Is it attitudes about working remote? Is it attitudes about leadership and credibility of institutions? Think about whatever it is, but develop a point of view as opposed to having a static view about how things are. Let me share one other article with you. This is an article that came out in the Wall Street Journal in December that was a bottoms-up analysis about business travel. And it was an interesting analysis because they had people look at, why do people travel on business? And they looked at the reasons, and it was intra-company training. It was all the training we go to inside a company where they fly people into a certain location and they go through training. It was sales visits and multiple sales meetings over a period of a year that were all in person. What this journalist and analyst said is they believe up to 36% of all business travel will go away permanently. Now, obviously, the CEOs of United Airlines and Delta Airlines and American, they're not going to like to hear this, and they're not going to agree with it. They keep saying it's all going to come back. I personally agree more with this article than the airline CEOs. Now, I don't know it's going to be as high as 36%. But I believe some reasonable portion is never going to come back, because people have realized, you know what, if I interact with you once or twice in person, doesn't mean I need to then keep coming by to see you every month or 2 months. It's too much wear and tear on the body. It's bad on the environment. It's costly for companies, et cetera, et cetera. So a very interesting argument about where business travel can go. If you buy this premise, then think about the knock-on effects that this plays out with. Think about hospitality. Think about hotels like Marriott and what happens to companies like that. Think about what happens to the configuration of office space, that you may need more space for people to have bigger team meetings and less space for them to be in the office individually. And does that create a downdraft on real estate itself? So all those things to me are very important issues to be thinking about as you develop your own view about the new normal. So in summary here, a few things. One is that you look at technology, several key trends here. First of all, there's a notable shift from hardware to software. Much of what I told you tonight is about data, the use of data, how it's predictive. It creates recommendation engines and autonomous vehicles and all of that. Big shift to data. So if you're working with a hardware-based business, you want to be asking yourself, you know what, is this company going to get killed in the future because of the shift to data? Can they embed data in what they do? Can they create the Internet of Things with their hardware so that they're yielding data that creates a better outcome? Remember, a lot of that data is powering itself in the form of a prediction. So a recommendation engine, a diagnostic tool, et cetera. It's not just looking historically. More and more video and voice-based interaction with the internet, less texting and typing. Much more on digital immersive experiences, less person and more on a digital basis. Discontinuities of technology adoption. So this is the Twilio piece, 6 years to 6 months. Big shift in adoption. Acceleration of key trends. So e-commerce taking off, retail declining, lots of things shifting in this new normal. Outsiders. So many of the companies that I've referenced are not the incumbents in their industry. So when I was talking about retail, I wasn't talking about Kroger stores or Albertsons. I was talking about Amazon. When I was talking about transportation, I wasn't talking about Ford and GM. I was talking about Lyft and Uber and talking about Waymo, et cetera. So many outsider-in players that are the real threats of what's happening. Flight to scale, so many more big players because there's a big value on data. The more data you have, the more predictive capability you've got. And then this idea about the new normal is think about what might be a new normal. It's not as easy to say that we're going to revert past into the past of what we're going to be working on. So final slide for you is you kind of think about what are some of the issues to think about on a gap project in relation to what I just said. And I'd almost think about these as a check mark list to be able to answer for your own client. So number one, based on the role of technology, what's happened with COVID, et cetera, has the market demand changed for your client's business? You may say on one side, it's gone up radically because we're automating, we're creating a remote capability, we're using data, blah, blah, blah. You may say on the flip side, it's actually weakened the demand because the customers have prioritized something ahead of whatever you're wanting to sell to them. So how has that market demand changed? If it's a technology-based business, you may have good news because people are adopting technology much quicker. But if it's not technology-based, you may have a problem. How has the timing of the market changed? Again, have you seen a phenomenon that said it might have taken 2 or 3 years to enter a market? Now you've got a case that should only take you 6 months. That's a good piece of news, and you should be more ambitious about it. Again, you may see the opposite effect. If you got deprioritized, companies aren't doing well, you're selling to them, they're in a damage control mode, that's going to push out the revenue uptake in your business. How has the competitive landscape changed? More and more technology companies are winning. So I used to ask my gap teams that were doing kind of point solutions that were technology oriented, tell me why a larger tech company like a Microsoft wouldn't just bundle in whatever you're doing for free because they're trying to get a bigger bundled solution with their end customer. And if that's the case, not good for a small individual point solution client. You may find the opposite. You may find there's more of a demand for what you're doing because the big player can't bundle in a solution on their own. They need you to do it. But you want to think about that competitive landscape. Has it gotten more difficult or not? And have the terms of competition got tougher? In general, as the market shifts to data and software, the terms of competition are shifting to data. Do you have access to data, insights of data, et cetera, et cetera? Has the business model and the economics changed? So how are you going to monetize your offering? And has the use case gotten better or worse? If you are Instacart as an example, and you're looking at them from Safeway's point of view or Albertson's point of view, you may love Instacart because nobody's coming into your stores anymore, and you need a way to deliver economically. You could have the opposite effect that you don't want to have anything to do with anybody that's disrupting you. But thinking about how are you going to monetize and how does that change, again, the competitive landscape is key. Capital availability, can you raise capital against what you're doing? So you need to have an attractive use case. You need to be able to say that you're going to win in the market. You need to be able to be right timing in a market. And if you can do that, you can raise capital. But if you're raising capital on a 5-year-old assumption that everybody's going to come into an office building to get a test taken, you got the wrong, thing that you're raising capital against. It's going to get much more difficult. So I would look at that environment on fundraising. And then I would look at go-to-market. Once you've kind of looked at the total market, the competitiveness, et cetera, you have to say, how am I going to execute in the market? And what segments might you go to? You might make a case in an era of COVID where public health issues are so big that government segments are going to be more attractive because government has been leading on contact tracing or verification of vaccines or supply chain management on vaccine distribution. So government may be better. You want to think about what segments are going to be best. You want to think about geographies. So in today's world, the world is getting much more nationalized, less global, less interconnected. So you want to think about where you're doing business in the world, and is it going to be, a really uphill battle to sell in certain geographies today? That doesn't mean in the future it won't get better, but today. And then how do you think about the impact of all these activities on your sales activity? Can you do more virtual sales? Can you do training that's self-installed or self-training oriented that can reduce costs? But you want to think about all of these things in this current environment, again, due to technology and due to